When the B-52 bomber was ordered in the early 50s, the Air Force thought it would be replaced in a decade or so by a follow-on, more modern aircraft. The B-1 was to be such a replacement. It is the most capable bomber in the world. The B-1 uses extremely advanced engines and a variable sweep wing to carry twice the payload, greater distances, at much higher speed than the B-52. In 1977, with the cost per airplane approaching $100 million, plans to build 241 B-1s were canceled. The new cruise missile technology seemed to offer a cheap alternative, but the cruise missile must be carried by an airplane which can safely get off the ground and fly close enough to release its cruise missiles. The B-1 was designed to do this. Its quick response, short takeoff, rapid acceleration, and hardness against nuclear blast effects makes it many times more likely to survive a surprise attack than the B-52. Flying at treetop altitudes, 600 miles per hour, the B-1 is very difficult to detect with radar or shoot down. As a cruise missile carrier or penetrator, the B-1 remains the soonest and best hope the U.S. has for an advanced manned weapon delivery system in the 80s. The Soviet Union already has 200 similar bombers, the backfire, against which we have little defense.
We dismantled the last of our air defenses in 1975 on the argument that since we had had an ABM treaty and we were defenseless against missiles, what difference did it make if we were also defenseless against bombers? We have a token air defense, what they call enough for control of the sovereignty of the air. We're still using 6 squadrons of F-106 interceptors, which are late 50s technology, most of them manned by the reserve. I should also add that there's a very formidable Soviet bomber force. And they're going to have a free ride. They can roam the country, either after a missile exchange or instead of a missile exchange, and attack or threaten to attack more or less at will. If we deployed some modern interceptors, some F-14s or 15s, both of them are very good, under the control of AWACS aircraft, the new airborne warning and control system, we could have a very significant air defense.
The radar net, while it's old, is fairly good at higher altitudes. At lower altitudes, there are gaps. But it does present an avenue where a manned bomber, high speed, in small numbers, could penetrate without warning. And it gives him another alternative. We're talking, of course, about the backfire bomber, but it applies equally as well to the Bear and Bison aircraft, or more seriously to the aircraft he's developing at this time. He's working hard. He's got a B-1. He's got plans. He's thinking in terms of the aircraft that would follow these particular current operational models. So it also poses a very real threat.
The Soviets, in all probability, have the capacity to knock out our Minuteman system. Nobody knows for sure, including the Soviets, because no one has ever practiced an attack of this sort. There have been all sorts of tests, but there has never been any operational experience, and we hope that it remains that way. The Soviet leaders should bear in mind, of course, that while they may have the capacity to attack and destroy our Minuteman system, if we ride out the attack, that they can never even be sure of that. And they should never be given assurance that the United States would simply ride out an attack.
The reason it's important that they not have in their mind that they might succeed in such an attack has to do with what their ambitions are. What is it that they really would like to achieve? They would like to separate the United States from its European allies. They would like to neutralize and circle communist China. They would like to expand their influence and get to a position of control over the Persian Gulf. If they control the Persian Gulf, then they can dictate where the energy supplies of the Persian Gulf go. They can then, that will support their policy of dividing European NATO from the United States, of encircling China by neutralizing Japan and Southeast Asia. And it will also have a bearing on what happens in the African continent. So that their entire policy and our entire policy may depend upon what happens in the Middle East.
The rest of the world has recognized that since 1945, the balance of power has been maintained by the United States. None of our allies, the former great powers like Britain, Germany, are in a position to do that. Only the United States has the power to serve as a counterweight to the Soviet Union. And as our military capacity has flagged, and more importantly, as we have been perceived to be vacillating on foreign policy issues, our allies and the third world nations have begun to make adjustments in their position. They have begun to consider accommodations with the Soviet Union. And as a consequence, our position worldwide can deteriorate rapidly, even in the absence of an attack on the United States directly.
People look at the United States and say, to what extent are they concerned about displeasing the United States? They look at the Soviet Union and ask themselves, to what extent can they afford to provoke the Soviet Union? Then they're faced with a decision. Every day something comes up. Do we boycott the Olympics or we don't boycott the Olympics? On the invasion of Afghanistan. Do we speak for or against the Soviet Union at the United Nations debate? Do we give trade concessions to the Americans or the Russians? And when they make these decisions, they look at the power of each, and on the basis of their perception of the strength of each side, their feeling of it, on that basis they decide.
The outer world recognizes that the Soviet political system has been a failure. The only asset that the Soviet Union has is military power. They recognize that. In the absence of the employment of the threat of that military power, the free world will win in the long run.
People have seen us going downhill, downhill, downhill. First of all, we have to at least give them the feeling that we can recover. Second, we have to put substance into this by going back to a serious effort in terms of raising our military strength. We're now spending 5% and a bit of our GNP. We're competing against the Soviet Union that is spending much more than that. In absolute terms, in real terms, we have to go back competing again. That means more money. I think it means conscription, young people in the service, so we get value for our money, and it will mean, of course, a variety of weapon programs. The third thing we have to do is that in the interim period, when we move from weakness to strength, we have to be very careful, because the temptation upon the Soviet Union to intervene, to prevent us from recovering, to prevent us from reestablishing a deterrence and a balance of power, the temptation will be very great. I don't see the Russians as Nazis. The Russians are not Nazis. They don't relish war and so on. But if we do recover and start moving back towards recovery, there will be a great temptation for them to try and stop us.
When the U.S. forces become vulnerable, the Soviets will know that as well as the U.S. will know it. And the Soviets may read that as an inclination on the part of the U.S. to strike first, rather than to wait for the Soviets to attack and leave nothing surviving in the U.S. strategic forces. This contributes to strategic nuclear instability, to a greater incentive on the part of all sides to try to attack first. And the last thing you want in this world is any incentive for a country to attack with nuclear forces presumptuously, preemptively, quickly.